The initials PBB evoke powerful memories to many people in the state of Michigan.
It was 19 years ago that the toxic chemical was accidentally mixed in animal feed, precipitating a terrible crisis. Tonight's TV 9 and 10's John McGowan begins a look back at this environmental disaster.
It was an unbelievable turn of events which brought these farmers to slaughter their cattle and bury them in this Kalkaska County pit throughout 1974 and 75. Somehow the fire retardant chemical polybrominated biphenyl, forever after known as PBB, was sent by Michigan Chemical Company to a Farm Bureau facility in Battle Creek instead of a feed additive. That chemical was mixed with feed and sent all over the state, contaminating cattle, chickens, and other animals, and eventually human beings. It was one of the worst environmental disasters in history, confined almost exclusively to Michigan. Northern areas were extremely hard hit. More than 100 farms were quarantined in Missaukee County. Osceola, Mecosta, and Newaygo counties were also hit hard by the food chain contamination.
We started having some problems with our cows. We called up Doc Clark, the vet out of McBain there, and then after, he treated 2 or 3 cases of, different symptoms and stuff, and he says, all of a sudden he says, maybe you guys ought to test for PBB. And then we tested some animals and they were low, and then we tested one animal that was over the quarantine level, and so I think we bought the cows in August and we were quarantined in December. It's only 5 months later we were quarantined.
After the feed was contaminated in 1973, it took 9 months before a downstate farmer named Rick Halbert, with a background in chemistry, finally tracked down PBB as the culprit. By then, virtually everyone in the state had consumed contaminated meat, milk, or eggs, but it was farm families who suffered the most.
We were all blood tested at the time, and my father and I are both had quite high amounts, and Mom did too. And they have had health problems since probably 2 years after we were quarantined. They have both had health problems in the next year, within the same year of each other.
For a long time after the contamination, farmers in this part of the state thought they were safe from the crisis. When they began having health problems with their herds, it took local vet Alpha Clark of McBain to pinpoint the problem.
I was asked to go to Fremont to judge a show, a registered Holstein show in Fremont, and during the intermission I was talking to one of the farmers down there, because that's where the original PBB was supposed to have gone, and we weren't even supposed to have gotten any up here. And as I listened to these guys talk during the hour, it dawned on me that what they had was exactly what we had.
Because of an incredibly unlikely accident, lives were disrupted, the food chain contaminated, and people's health threatened. And as one author put it, a state was poisoned, the effects of which we're still learning. Tomorrow night, a look at a response to the accident, a response which one state official said was, quote, mired in a swamp of ignorance. I'm John McGowan for TV 9 and 10, the news leader.
John tells us that more than 30,000 animals were buried in the Kalkaska County pit.
Look forward to that 4-part series. Bill Spencer.
Well, the accidental introduction of the fire retardant chemical PBB into animal feed in 1973 precipitated a terrible environmental crisis.
As TV 9 and 10's John McGowan reports, the crisis hit the farm community the hardest and left some bitter feelings toward the state of Michigan's response to that situation.
Following the contamination of Michigan feed grain in 1973, it took 9 months to identify PBB as the contaminant. Once that was finally done, officials thought the worst of the crisis was over, but that was not the case. PBB proved hard to get rid of. It stayed in the feed grain mixing plants, it stayed in the soil, it stayed in the animals, and it stayed in human beings. So even when officials thought they had gotten rid of it, they were wrong, and it continued to remain in the food chain.
PBB is an amazing chemical, and as I'm sure you've told your listeners in years past, very little was known about this chemical when it first got into the food chain. That's why the high degree of concern about the fact that humans were exposed. We've learned a lot about PBB since, and there's no doubt that it's a toxic substance.
Limits were set on how much PBB should be considered safe in animals, but many thought those limits were arbitrary and unscientifically set. Some farmers sold their recontaminated cattle, which fell below the limit, and low-level contaminated milk continued to be put on the market. Some farmers, though, rather than do that, eventually slaughtered their own herds, receiving no compensation, and left the business.
It was a real crisis for a lot of people. When you're, it was an emotional crisis and it was a financial crisis. You're sitting there, if you raised a herd of cows, like I had a neighbor had the top herd in the county at that time, and, that sort of that's a farmer's source of pride, and all of a sudden, he sees them fall apart. That's got to be hard on him. Plus, financially, a lot of the farm, it was hard on us financially, and you know, if you don't do anything about it, sometimes things just don't get done.
Some farmers who were compensated and were able to reach settlements with Farm Bureau and Michigan Chemical eventually began again, but had a bitter taste in their mouths from what they said was a slow response by the state to the crisis.
I got real frustrated too. You know, the state just dragged its feet and dragged its feet. Some of these guys were quarantined. We were only quarantined 9 months, but some of these guys were quarantined for a year and a half.
You can go one or two ways. You can either call it cover-up or you can call it bureaucratic bungling. So go, if they say they don't know, they bungled it. So take either way you want.
Part of the response problem, say officials now, was ignorance of what they were dealing with and in identifying the chemical at the time. A problem they would not have today, according to MSU Veterinary College Associate Dean Ed Mather.
So the educational programs have been put in place in the last few years. The diagnostic laboratory has been organized in a better way. There is equipment available that was not available. In all due respect to the people that were working on the problem, they didn't have the technology to deal with it as we have now.
It became obvious that high levels of PBB had a negative impact on animals, as did low levels spread out over a long period of time. The same seemed to hold true for humans, and in that regard, a long-term study of the health effects of PBB on farm families continues today. Tomorrow we'll take a look at that study and where things stand. I'm John McGowan for TV 9 and 10, the news leader.
Thank you, John. And former Governor William Milliken declined an invitation to be a part of this PBB report. Welcome back. The health of Michigan farm families has been under the medical microscope since the toxic chemical PBB entered the food chain in 1973.
Tonight, in the third part of his series, PBB, A Look Back, TV 9 and 10's John McGowan looks at an ongoing study of farm families exposed to the chemical.
9 months between the time PBB was mixed into cattle feed in Battle Creek and the time the contamination was discovered, virtually every man, woman, and child in the state was exposed to the chemical in either meat, milk, or poultry. Farm families who ate their own beef and were around the contaminated environment built up higher PBB levels in their bodies than did the general population.
We were all blood tested at the time, and my father and I are both had quite high amounts, and Mom did too. And they have had health problems since probably 2 years after we were quarantined. They have both had health problems in the next year, within the same year of each other.
In 1976, the Michigan Department of Health began a long-term study of the health of farm families who were exposed to PBB. The study is in its third 5-year phase. Dr. Harold Humphrey is the project director of that study.
It's amazing. Even today, years later, I get calls from all over the country, former residents of Michigan or various people wanting to know about PBB even today.
Humphrey says he and his staff are in the process of contacting project families again for an update on their health history over the last few years. He says preliminary results show the study group faring well, but
PBB has stayed in their systems, and there's no question that the half-life of PBB in the human body is a very long half-life. It's probably measured in decades. We've tried to make various calculations over the time, but suffice it to say, many of the study participants today, years after their original exposure, still have circulating PBB in their blood. As long as PBB is still in you, then the threat, if you will, of what it might mean is still there and needs to be evaluated.
because contaminated cattle had trouble reproducing, some affected farm families were concerned that they might be more prone to fertility problems or having deformed offspring. So far, Humphrey says that does not appear to be a problem.
The health indices, it has happened in humans, the same kinds of things that were being seen in the farm animals back then. And in many of these cases, the answer is no. Fertility is a good issue. I would say this population group is not infertile in any way, and 1,000 kids prove it. And the statistics are there. There's very healthy reproductive success in these families.
Humphrey anticipates that the study on the farm families will continue for the next 5 or 6 years. One of the questions raised by the PBB crisis, perhaps the question, is could it happen again? We'll ask that question in tomorrow night's report. I'm John McGowan for TV 9 and 10, the news leader.
John tells us the department is not studying the long-term effects of PBB on Michigan's general population.
Crisis in Michigan. That fact has caused many to take another look at the state's worst environmental disaster. Among them, an Alma College professor who has written a major paper on the subject. TV 9 and 10's John McGowan reports.
They are the images of the PBB crisis of the 70s. Few will ever forget the dead cattle being shot and buried at the Kalkaska and Mayo pits, most of them contaminated by the toxic fire retardant PBB. But the people of St. Louis have a constant reminder of the crisis, a huge piece of empty ground which used to house the Michigan Chemical Company.
I think there are some lessons just in general about how the process was conducted in trying to address the very obvious pollution that grew out of the production of the PBB.
Dr. Ed Lorenz had very little knowledge of the PBB crisis when he came to Alma College, but while students were researching the subject, his interest was piqued. What started out as a project for some of Lorenz's students became more. Lorenz himself became interested in the subject of PBB and researched the public policy and political issues raised by the crisis. Lorenz says one of the ironies was that Michigan was probably more progressive than most states in environmental protection at the time, but proved totally unprepared for this crisis.
The PBB, for example, was seen as almost a miracle chemical that helped prevent children's sleepwear from burning as rapidly as it otherwise would. There were public policies encouraging the development of fire retardants such as the PBB.
While the factory site has been cleaned up, Lorenz has concern for the adjacent Pine River, which he says has never received appropriate attention.
And the river could have been cleaned. It may have been very costly, but yet the river was the location that was in contact with the public at all times, and we gave that no attention.
The main lesson to learn from the PBB crisis, Lorenz says, is to never doubt that it could happen again. In St. Louis, I'm John McGowan for TV 9 and 10, the news leader.
And Lorenz presented his findings at the annual meeting of the Western Political Science Association in March. Well, concern over the safety in the food chain has risen in Michigan since the PBB crisis of the 1970s.
But chemicals, more often than not pesticides, still make their way into our food. Tonight, in the final part of his series, PBB, A Look Back, TV 9 and 10's John McGowan looks at the response to those events today.
The PBB crisis of the mid-70s was unique only in that contamination of animal feed was widespread and not detected positively until 9 months after the fact. There are other ways the food supply can become contaminated, and since the PBB crisis, that has been a major concern of agricultural officials at Michigan State University.
We have a pretty good idea of what the incidence of respiratory disease is. We have a pretty good incidence of what the incidence of mastitis, foot problems, toxicologic problems, viral problems. We have a pretty good roadmap, and so if in Cadillac or someplace else you have a higher incidence than you would expect, we know that there must be something happening there that's unusual.
Officials and the farmers we spoke with agree that the response to recent episodes has been swift and effective.
You know, if you remember, it was the ethylene dibromide, EDB, was in grain. It was used to fumigate the grain, and salt was in cake mixes and etc. Well, other people on campus said, you know, the grain is also fed to, like, chickens. And somebody asked the question, well, is it going to be in the chickens? And nobody knew. Nobody knew. But we were able to quickly get a group together, and in a pretty short period of time, fed them the grain, looked at the flesh, and we were able to detect at very low levels. So we knew with great confidence whether or not this was going to be a problem.
I thought they did a decent job. It was some cottonseed that had some contamination in it, alpha toxins, and that was it. They showed up in the milk, and our milk was quarantined, within 3 or 4 days, and within 2 weeks, and then they told us what to do, and we quit feeding it, and they got it out of the area, and within 2 weeks it was all gone. And really, I thought they did a good job there. So I guess they're more prepared. Yeah.
Those types of responses have instilled more confidence in many farmers since the crisis days of the PBB contamination, when many affected farmers felt abandoned by Farm Bureau, Michigan State's Agriculture Department, and the State Department of Agriculture. Now they say they've put the episode behind them the best they can and have gone on with their lives.
Probably 6 months after we had our cows, we kind of settled back into routine and a new parlor set up and tried to kind of forget what had happened before.
Our herds are back, our cow numbers are back up. Our cow treatments are back to normal. We have the same problems we had before. They're any different now than it was before PBB struck. It's a normal situation given the change in management. Mm-hmm. It's just, we're all, I think we're doing all right.
Now, John joins us now, and for people like me who were not living here in the 70s, this has been a very interesting and informative series you've done, John.
Well, thank you, Kathy. But in closing this report, I want to say this to those who thought the PBB issue should have been left alone all this time. A whole generation has grown up since this crisis happened, which I think makes it important that they hear about what happened here. That means taking it out of the closet, dusting it off, and perhaps reliving some painful memories. Hopefully, that will remind us how fragile the food chain is, because it affects each and every one of us.
Well, John, it sounds like this PBB episode was an extremely complex issue.
That's exactly right. And we've just scratched the surface in this series, which is why, if anybody would like to know more about it, I recommend the books The Poisoning of Michigan by Joyce Eggington and PBB, An American Tragedy by Edwin Chen. Both are very good. They tell the story very well. And hopefully they're all available at your local libraries.
All right, thanks a lot, John. You told it well this week, too.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot, John.
Thank you.